Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to episode 11. Have you ever wondered if your facility is turning guests away? Do visitors show up once and then not come back? Is it something you said? On this week's episode, AJ and I dive deep into what it takes to make a great first impression. We get really specific and give practical, actionable tips to help get your facility guest ready, many of which don't cost any money at all. We'll also help you prioritize how you should spend money in facility updates so you get the most bang for your buck. Your facilities shouldn't be a barrier to the gospel. This episode will help you leverage your facility to be more effective at sharing Christ. To read today's show notes, visit malphursgroup.com/11, the number 11. If you like today's podcast, please subscribe, share it with your friends in ministry. Now, let's dive in.
All right, today we are talking about getting your facility guest ready. This is extremely important, and I'm glad we're talking about this today, Scott, because the old adage, you never get a second chance at a good first impression.
The first thing I feel like we need to mention just briefly, I don't want to harp on this, but the reason why it's important to have a good guest experience is not because you need to become the coolest church in town. That is not why we do this.
Sure.
I think sometimes churches almost wear it as a badge of honor, like we're not flashy, we're just, we are who we are, and they use that as like an excuse not to have a good guest experience because. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like we're just, we're just more of a family church, or we're more of a community church. We're not we're not lights and fog. You don't need to be lights and fog, but don't use that as an excuse. And the reason why this is important is, this is an element of evangelism. That Absolutely. Connection you make with a guest the first time is a way of sharing Christ with them. And so for you to not take that seriously, that connection, is to not take evangelism itself seriously. Mm-hmm. So this podcast is not going to tell you how to become the coolest church in town. That's not our goal. We just want you to make a really great first impression with a guest for the sake of the gospel.
Well, and we're making an assumption here as well that that you would want to have people join you. So if you don't want your church to grow, and we're not talking not for the sake of growth, but for the sake of people coming to know Christ as Savior, if that's not your primary goal, having a great episode, you can go ahead and click off. You have permission to tune into something else.
This isn't for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to start off with this ties into our first point, AJ, which is that it starts online. But here's two fast facts, two fast stats for you. Number one, guests will make a decision about coming to your church or not, again, within the first 15 minutes.
Yes.
So that first 15 minutes is really critical. In fact, we'll probably do a whole episode on maximizing that first 15 minutes. But the other fact, and this ties straight into our first point, was that the first-time guest experience starts online, is that 75% of consumers admit to making judgments on a company's credibility based on the company's website design. Mm-hmm. Can you believe that?
But church is not a company, though, Scott.
Yeah, but people don't turn off that judgment filter just because you're not a company.
That's right. That is absolutely right. And maybe even crank it up a notch.
Yeah.
Honestly, a lot of people are stepping outside of their comfort zone to be considering going to your church, whether maybe they've never been to a church before, maybe they're coming back to the faith. You will probably be under a stronger microscope, maybe than Lowe's and Home Depot or that new restaurant down the street.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're asking for something more than money. Mm-hmm. You're asking for their free time. That's more valuable than their money.
Yeah.
So at any rate, so it starts online, and we actually did a whole episode on maximizing your online experience. last week. So if you've not listened to that episode, go back and listen to it. We won't rehash everything that we did in that episode. We gave you 8 things to evaluate about your online presence, and so go there. But we just want to mention that your on-site experience starts online.
Yep.
And so that's point number 1. Number 2, AJ.
Number 2, can your church be found easily? So there's a couple of points that we're making here. One, making sure that as much as within your control, that GPS is fairly accurate. So a lot of times, I mean, you put an address in, and addresses may not match up perfectly. Certainly, I've found this a lot with rural churches. Scott, I know you have too. You put an address in, maybe that pinpoint is at the actual church. Maybe it's, around the corner, a quarter mile down on the other side of the road. I've seen that a lot. And some of that's not within your control. Your address just may not come up right in Google's database, but you could switch over to, longitudinal coordinates, and maybe get that pin more accurate, especially if you're placing it on your website.
Another point online is that Google's really good at finding your church, especially if you have a website. Apple Maps, which a lot of people have, is less good at finding your church.
Less good, yeah.
That's just a fact of life. So I have had now, I can think of 2 instances in the last 18 months where I visited a church and they were not in Apple Maps. When I was going to consult with them, I typed in the name of the church in Apple Maps and they didn't show up. And I had to go Google them, find them online, copy their address and paste it into the phone. And so you can get listed on Apple Maps, but you might not even know that your church isn't on there. So like right now, well, if you're driving, don't do it. But if you're in a spot, like pull up your phone and make sure that people could actually find your church in Apple Maps. You might be assuming that they can, and they can't. And there's a process online. You can Google it on how to get listed, but you want to make sure that that you're not just in Google Maps, but you're also in Apple Maps. That's really important since a lot of people have iPhones. The other thing is, you mentioned, AJ, that in a rural situation, the pin might be off, but in a more urban or suburban situation, and this ties into the physical property piece, is that it might get you to the right spot, but if a church will be sort of back a ways from the main road, and there might be like a business that's sort of blocking the view of exactly where the church is. And so the driveway is right there and it's pretty easy to get to. But if you don't have good signage right there, I might completely miss your church. And again, you might think that's ridiculous because it's really obvious, but I worked with a church once in the Northeast. They were in a really great location right next to a Target. But they were, the building was white, the sign was white, and it was at a place that snows for months out of the year. People could easily miss that building, right? So be aware of that, whether you're in a rural spot and the GPS sort of misses the mark, or you're in an urban spot and your building's kind of off the road a little ways and maybe blocked by a view, or the driveway's kind of long, or whatever. You've got to have really good signage there at the road so people know where to turn in.
Yeah, absolutely. Which brings up kind of a couple of other points on this section here. What you can do as far as signs outside to make yourself visible. And of course, there's tons of sign rules, depending on where your church is located, what city you're located in. But there's a lot of great options out there for temporary signage. It's easy for volunteers to put out on a Sunday morning that can make it really obvious where to turn in.
Yeah, the human eye, God has designed the human eye to be attracted to 2 things, color and movement.
Mm-hmm.
So as much as you can put those 2 things into a sign, that's why those sort of feather flag signs are really good, because they're kind of tall, they move in the wind, and you can make them a bright color.
Yeah.
The tip is, even if your city allows you to put those at the road, and leave them up, if you wanted to, don't leave them up all the time, because then it just becomes part of the background noise. People are used to seeing them all the time when they drive past that part of town. You only want to put them out on Sunday so that it's different enough that people notice
Mhm.
that the flag is there. It only works if it's out there sometimes.
So you can put a purple gorilla on your roof, but only inflate it on Sundays.
Only inflated on Sundays. And we're laughing about that, but seriously, like, do what it takes. We're talking about the gospel here. Like, put something out there that grabs people's attention so they know
Yeah.
where to turn. All right. So point 1 is starts online. Point 2, can I actually find your church? Like, when I type it in online and when I'm pulling up physically, can I easily find your church? All right. Number 3, AJ, is don't neglect the parking lot.
Absolutely. Yeah. When you roll into a church, I mean, what's happening? Is it easy to find guest parking? Is the parking lot even in bad condition? Faded stripes? Are people just parked all wonky because those stripes have been gone for a long time? So, this is something that's often overlooked, and sometimes it's expensive if a parking lot's gotten in really bad shape. But sometimes it's not either. So it's just another point that you need to be paying attention to.
Yeah. Speaking of volunteer work, I mean, I am not handy by any stretch of the imagination, but I've restriped a parking lot on it, so it's not rocket science.
Mm-hmm.
You can get the equipment to do that at Lowe's. And it takes a Saturday morning to get it done, but you can get it done. But the big thing here is we recommend at least 6% of your parking spaces be reserved for guests.
Mm-hmm.
So you might be thinking, well, 6%, like, I don't know exactly how many parking spaces we have, but just think about that first row, whatever the most if it's easier to think of it that way, the closest row to your primary entrance should be reserved for, accessible parking and guest parking. And we see a lot, even in older churches or declining churches, that they once had visitor parking or guest parking. We prefer guest versus visitor parking, but the signs often are faded. You can barely read it that it says visitor parking. So you want to make sure that those things stay fresh and up to date.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned, Scott, in the show notes for this episode as well about having like umbrellas and things available. And I've seen churches do that, to have just a bunch of umbrellas there. So if it's raining when you're leaving, starts raining when you're, if it wasn't raining and you didn't bring an umbrella, have some umbrellas there. And that's what a great youth volunteer thing to be able to walk people out with an umbrella and bring that back in. And kind of on the other side of that as well, my church has a stand with umbrella bags. So whenever you come into church with your wet umbrella, you can slip it right into a clear bag, and everybody is not dripping their umbrellas all over church as they walk in. So
yeah, people will say things like, in smaller churches we hear, well, we don't have enough people here. We don't have a parking problem. Like, there's not so many people here that we really need a parking team to help people get parked. And I hear that, but it's not just about having someone to help with the logistics of parking. Although if your church is growing, you might need that. It's about having faces and greeters in the parking lot who are beginning that experience for a guest. And so I'll never forget when my wife and I had really small kids still in infant carriers. We would, I can think one specific time that we went to Chick-fil-A. This might have even happened more than once, but we went to Chick-fil-A and we were pulling up and trying to get out of the car with the infant carrier, and you've got the diaper bag and you got all this stuff, and then we had one of our kids who was not in an infant carrier, and you're trying to hold their hand and get them unbuckled, and an employee from Chick-fil-A saw us, walked out to our car with an umbrella and stood there so that we could get out of the car and not get wet because it was raining. And it was pouring actually, and they walked us into the Chick-fil-A. Like that's what we're talking about. Like, they don't need someone in the parking lot to facilitate the mechanics of parking. They have people who are watching the parking lot like that so that they can serve their guests. And we want you to take that same attitude.
Exactly. Next one. Your lobby should smell good and look fresh. Yeah. People don't probably often talk about the smell of a church, do they, publicly?
Well, we talk about it a lot.
We do.
Yeah. I don't know how often people in general do. we talk about it disproportionate to probably the average person.
Yeah.
It's because we smell a lot of churches, and a lot of them don't smell very good.
Old things end up not smelling good. And, not that you're intentionally making your church smell bad, but, 20, 25, 30-year-old carpet and old paint and old furnishings and old fake flowers, these things end up attracting and holding on to odors. And you just need to be aware of that. We call it nose blind. You just like you walk over that tear in the carpet for the last 5 years, or the water-stained ceiling tile above your Sunday school class. Your eye doesn't see it anymore. Your nose stops smelling the things that are going on, but a visitor will notice it right away as they walk in from the fresh outdoors. So you may need to have somebody that just come over and go, what does our church smell like? Because I don't smell it anymore.
Yeah. There's a sense that churches have, I think, when they're wanting to turn around, that if we're going to renovate our building, well, then it would have to be the whole building. Like a renovation project would have to be everything. And get that out of your brain. Like start with the most high trafficked areas of your church that a guest would see, which are going to be, and we're going to talk about worship space and children's space in a minute, but it's going to be those two spaces and your lobby. Those are going to be the three areas. And honestly, I would probably do them in this order: lobby, children's space, worship space. I'd probably hit it in that order. Lobby first because it's easy to do and every guest walks into it. Children's space because those are you want to reach families, and then your worship space. Lots of times we see it in that opposite order, AJ. People work on their worship space first, and then their children's space, and then their lobby. But hit that lobby first. It's a quick win for your church. It's probably not going to be very expensive to modernize it, to update it, and it would make a big difference. So rip out that old carpet, put down some inexpensive vinyl flooring, or get some new carpet squares that are easy to replace when spills and things inevitably happen. Update the furniture in there. If you live close enough to an IKEA, or you could make a day trip. If you're a guy listening to this, your wife would not mind it if you said, "Hey, let's drive 3 hours to Charlotte." I live 3 hours from Charlotte, and if I said, "You know what, honey, we've got to drive to Charlotte to go to IKEA," she would not be sad about that. She'd be all about it. So, go to IKEA, get some cheap furniture that's new, and just think about that. And the smell. Let's talk about the smell. How can you make your lobby smell good? Once that new carpet, sort of new furniture smell goes away, that everyone likes that smell of something new. But when that starts to fade, how do we make sure it stays smelling nice, AJ?
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, of course, paint is helpful as well. But you could just add your own scents to your lobby. Coffee is a great one. Most people love the smell of coffee, and that's just also a nice guest feature as well. Anyway, if you had some free coffee out for people to have a cup, that's going to really help out. You could certainly use, diffusing oils and other air fresheners, but be very careful with that. Yeah. And that's another thing that you could become nose blind to, and people get hit with a wall of, garden meadow and like, oh my goodness, somebody's gone overboard on the air freshener. So you've got to be careful with that also. You probably can't overdo it on the coffee smell if it's actually coming from coffee.
Unless it was burnt coffee. Burnt coffee smells not good.
Yeah, that urn that you started at 5:30 this morning and is still cooking at 11. Yeah.
Yeah, like when you walk into a 7-Eleven, you're like, that coffee shouldn't be touched. Okay. Bonus note on smelling things and clean things: the bathroom. Those need to be just kept nice. You already know that, though. You didn't need us to tell you that. But here's a little tip. Lots of times you might not be thinking about it, but like whoever cleans your bathrooms for you might clean like on a Monday or Tuesday, but then you have Wednesday night programming or groups that meet throughout the week, and so by the time you get to Sunday, the paper towels could be out, or toilet paper could be out, or soap could be out, or trash cans could be full of paper towels. You want to make sure that Thursday, Friday, like whenever things are kind of wrapped up for the week ministry wise, you just do a double check. on the simple things so that when people show up on Sunday, the trash can isn't already full, because then by the end of the service, like it's overflowing, and that's a bad look. So just be sure that you manage the timing of restocking and cleaning the bathrooms so it's after sort of the main ministry for the week.
And that should be something also that you've just got a little checklist. There's a little volunteer team that is going to check that in between services if you have two, or just give it that quick Sunday morning once over. Don't put that off on somebody that nobody really knows whose responsibility that is.
Yeah, I would even say this, like it shouldn't be your job as the pastor to be cleaning that all the time, but I will say it's on you to check occasionally. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I just feel like it's a good look. Like, just do a look around. We used to do this all the time. There were things that we would check as leaders every week, just to make sure that they were done. You know, we would check and make sure that the chair backs had pins.
Yeah.
We'd make sure that the bathrooms were in decent shape and the trash was emptied. Like, we would just do a check. We had people who did all that, but we would just do a walkthrough to make sure that the facility was ready for guests. So don't do all the work, but do a check. Make that part of your routine.
Yeah. Okay, next, let's talk about kid spaces and being kid friendly to, the best of our budget ability, Scott.
Yeah. So the first thing is it's safety first. Parents are so hypersensitive to this. I've got 2 kids. My son is 7. My daughter is 4, almost 5. I'm always thinking about safety. And is this a place that's safe for my kids? So there's really, we're now without excuse for not having good check-in systems. And I really don't want to hear that, we can't afford to get away from some churches don't even have a written sign in.
Yeah.
So that's really a problem, but it's just not safe. It's just not the best way to do it. Get a digital system. It's not expensive. And what it communicates to parents is really important. So there's lots of good options. Planning Center's good. One Church Software is pretty inexpensive. Elvanto. None of these are sponsors. We've got links in the show notes for you to check all of those options out at varieties of price points, but there's going to be one that fits your budget, and you need to do that. So safety is number one. But past that, AJ, kid friendly. Like when I take my kids somewhere, I'm looking around going, is there something that my kids can break? A couple weeks ago, my wife and I went down to Atlanta with our kids, and we went to the Children's Museum of Atlanta, and I could sit down and not worry. One, it was safe. There was only one way in and one way out of that space, and they had people watching there, so kids couldn't get out. So safety, check. Then the space was like they couldn't break anything, and I, as a parent, relaxed, and my kids had a blast. And I was literally thinking while I was there, man, churches that want to thrive should build spaces like this. They don't have to be extravagant or huge or whatever, but spaces where parents want to bring their kids because their kids can be kids there. And it's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of churches go really, really extravagant on kid spaces. You don't have to go extravagant, but make sure that you've got, good functional toys, fun things. We're talking, like smaller kids. And so that parents are excited about their kids being there, and the kids are excited. I mean, that's going to be a big factor in people returning to your church. If the kids hated it, you could bet the parents are probably not going to be anxious to bring them back to a space that they're going to be crying and complaining about.
Listen, I'm going to throw Chick-fil-A another bone here.
Yep.
You'll never visit a Chick-fil-A that doesn't have, unless it's in a mall. You'll never visit a standalone Chick-fil-A that doesn't have a kids area and good Wi-Fi. Why? They want parents to be able to come, watch their kids play. They've got, you know what I'm saying? Like their core target audience is families.
Yeah. And
they've built their whole experience around making it good for families. Maybe you're like, no, we're a church for old people and we're fine with that. Like then maybe you don't care about your kids' spaces. But if you want to reach families, don't be mad that you're not reaching young families, but then you've got nothing for the kids.
Yeah. All right, moving on. Your worship space has got to be clean and functional. So we've walked through our lobby. We've gotten the kids into their space, and now mom and dad are finally sitting down and they're exhaling and they're ready for an amazing sermon that we know you've got ready
Just
for
gonna
them.
knock it out of the park.
That's right.
Yeah. The real point that I want to make here, AJ, is similar to the point of this whole podcast, is that we're trying to remove barriers between people and the gospel and the message that you're trying to communicate. And in your worship space can be a barrier. Things like really harsh fluorescent lighting, clutter. I see clutter a lot on church stages because maybe you've gone away. Maybe you do a blended service now, and sometimes there's choir and sometimes there's a band, but now you're trying to fit. You used to just put a choir up there. Now you're trying to fit a choir and a band up there, and it's a mess. Or oftentimes we'll see churches that have a praise team now and used to have a choir, but they still got the choir risers up there. So that takes up a whole bunch of space. And so there's really bad cable management, which means there's just, microphone cables like a rat's nest, sort of all up on the stage, and it's distracting. So you want to make sure that your stage area is clean, that you sort of modernize as much as you can. AJ, you and I were off before we got started here. We're talking about a church that I had worked with, I guess a year or two ago, that they're not like fancy lights, fog, big screens or anything like that, but they did a really simple renovation of their space to just get rid of some really old green carpet, took out the pews, put in some chairs, and cleaned up their stage area. Theirs was a stage that was just a mess. So they made those small, simple changes, and it looked like $1 million renovation, and they spent hardly anything on it. It was really inexpensive for them to do. And so, yeah, just make it functional, make it clean, remove those distractions. AJ, what are some of the other distractions that you think churches need to get rid of in their worship space?
Well, yeah, I would definitely be looking at the things, whatever it is you're doing, make sure that it's all functional and that it's, everything is good. Changing light bulbs out. I've been in a lot of sanctuaries, worship spaces that you look up, maybe they've got, a half a dozen chandeliers up there with like 8 bulbs on each of them, and there's 3 bulbs out, that kind of stuff. These are all distractions. These are things, especially think about a guest. They're going to be sitting there looking around the room. What's going to catch their eye? Is their eye going to be caught by, maybe some beautiful stained glass, or is it going to be caught by that light bulb that's burned out? So don't give them things to focus in on and let that be their takeaway. If you've got problems with sound equipment, gosh, we've all been in spaces and it happens to everybody, but a microphone, maybe a wireless mic, the battery goes dead or it starts to get real scratchy. But if you've got things like that happen a lot, and maybe it's a mic cable that needs to be replaced, do that before next Sunday so that you can eliminate that problem of some crazy sound thing going on. Or Scott, you've talked about projector bulbs that need to be replaced. If you've just got other tweaks that need to happen, make sure that, if you're putting song lyrics up there, that it's in good focus. Hasn't gotten out of focus or is fuzzy. You can't read it. So these are all things that, this is not a section on trying to turn your church into, quote unquote, contemporary worship or modern worship styles. Whatever you're doing, do it well.
Next, be intentional about interior signage. One of the things that I like to say at churches when I work with them is that every wall in your building is a billboard communicating a message.
Yep.
And so, I really want churches that I work with to go through those high traffic guest areas and look at every wall in every hallway, in every space, and just sort of look at it and go, is this wall communicating what we want it to? And so there are really 2 types of signage to keep in mind. One is wayfinding signage, and the other is what I call purpose signs. So real fast on wayfinding signage. Wayfinding is both a science and an art. Mm-hmm. It needs to kind of be designed in a particular way that catches people's eye. But there's really an art to figuring out where exactly should I place this and how should it be put together and all of that. Really briefly, I'll tell a story. I was in an airport last week that I had not been to before, and I was, I had like 30 minutes till I was boarding, and I was trying to find. This sounds so goofy. I'm going to sound like such a doofus, but I was trying to figure out where the TSA security checkpoint was. I walked past it, AJ, 3 or 4 times. Walked right past it. It was at an odd angle. It's hard to explain if you're listening to this. Like, you can't see how my hands and how I'm demonstrating this, but it was sort of an L-shaped building, and the entrance to the TSA was in the corner. And in my brain, I was used to seeing things in a corner as like a Hudson News. Because it was sort of across on the other corner was a restaurant. So in my brain, it was like, oh, these are the retail areas. And at any rate, I walked past it 3 times, AJ, and I could not find it. But the signage was terrible. There was no real clear sign, AJ, that said TSA checkpoint this way. And so I'm going to blame them and not myself.
Yeah, there you go. So in your church, that real clear sign needs to say something like restrooms or classrooms or, anything that the important places that people are going to want to know how to get to.
And the other takeaway from my goofy story is that things that might seem obvious to you, like, oh, it's really clear where that is, assume that people are like me at that airport, that I could have walked past it 3 times and not found it. Like,
right.
The signage needs to make it so obvious that you couldn't possibly miss it.
Well, the trap that smaller churches fall into is everybody knows where everything is. Or you've had maybe slow growth over a long period of time, and you're not 50 people anymore. Now you're 125, and you're getting a handful of visitors at least every month. But you're still thinking, we're just a small church. Everybody knows where everything is. Never, ever assume that.
The other mistake I see churches make is they give every space the same value in their signage. So, for example, the directions to restrooms and the worship space and the children's ministry areas are in the same size sort of font as adult Sunday school classrooms. And so you're kind of trying to figure, like, those things that are the most important spaces for a guest, you want those signs to be the most obvious. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense, AJ? Like, yeah. You want to give more visual real estate to the things that are more highly trafficked. And like, who cares if they know where room 107 is? Like, that they're less likely to go there anyway.
Yep. Everything. Yeah. Be careful with artwork. Be careful with everything that you do, because it all, somebody has a reason for putting something up to begin with. That may not translate well, even from the day it's hung. But from 5 or 10 years or 25 years ago, it may not mean anything to anybody anymore. So just look around. What's on the walls? But let's talk about more purpose signs, Scott. And I'm just going to jump in here and first of all talk about my pet peeve, and that's handmade signs. Handmade signs, I don't know, maybe there's almost never a good reason for a handmade sign. You either, if it needs to have a sign and you can't have one professionally produced yet, at least make it on a computer and print it. But writing something with a Sharpie and taping it on a wall over a trash can that says, please don't put, no, it doesn't say please, it says no popcorn bags. That, basically.
That's an oddly specific example, AJ.
Or keep door closed. Anything here is almost always needs to be corrected through policy and training. If you have a handmade sign in your church, go walk around your church after you listen to this. Go walk around. I guarantee every handmade sign hanging in your church could be corrected with policy and training.
Yeah, or you were passive aggressively not wanting to confront the one person who keeps doing it wrong, or that the youth ministry is not doing it right. Like, and just even be thoughtful about how you word things. So, like, very commonly we will walk into churches with older plumbing, and so they very reasonably will have a sign up about what not to flush down a toilet. You don't need to put in big red letters, don't flush this, and this. Like, have print a sign that says, please only flush toilet paper. I'm only supposed to flush toilet paper. Like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, you can word it in a positive way instead of wording it in a negative way. And so it's reasonable for you to have to sometimes have signs like that. But like AJ said, print them and then be conscious of how you're wording them. But beyond that, every wall is a billboard in your facility. So just be sure that if you've got posters up, or you've got a bulletin board up, or you've got all kinds of things that get put on walls, be sure that it's communicating what you want it to communicate about your church. And that's what a purpose sign is. A purpose sign is communicating the culture and and who your church is. It's not necessarily directing people to a certain thing. So it could be like about an upcoming sermon series or an upcoming event, or it could be about your vision or core values or your mission. But whatever it is, just be sure that it's doing a good job communicating what you want it to communicate. All right, let's move on to make your guest connection or / information center obvious. Again, don't have to spend a lot of money here. If you're a small church and you've got a really small lobby, maybe you don't have room for something big. It doesn't have to be big. It just has to be intentional. Have a place where guests can get information, learn more about your church. Most importantly, we wanted them on their website. In the last episode, we talked about having visitors to your website be able to take their next best step in planning a visit. Now we want them to take their next best step in becoming more engaged with your church. Maybe that's sort of a newcomer event of some kind, or hopefully you're not having them go straight from first-time guest to membership class, but whatever that next step is that you want them to take, have them be able to begin considering that next step in that guest connection area, AJ.
Yeah. It really does it does not need to be anything terribly fancy. I've just seen a lot of great executed guest connection areas that maybe had, a small professionally printed sign hanging maybe over a high top table and a volunteer there, with a couple of gift bags for guests, things like that. And we've certainly seen other churches that had much larger spaces. They had maybe a lot of printed information out, things like that. So you can do this definitely on the cheap.
Yeah. And I would say if you don't have one right now and you want to start one, I would start with something small. And here's why. If you have a lot of space, the temptation is going to be one to fill it with a lot of information. And a guest doesn't need a lot of information. They need the right information.
Yeah.
Which is about their next best step. So, and if you've got a big guest connection space, you want to look at that and go, hey, maybe we've got too much. I remember working with one particular church. They had, I think, like 15 or 20 different brochures available. And they said, well, we wanted everyone to have all the information that they could possibly need. I said, but this space isn't for that. This space is for a guest to get the information that they specifically need. Yeah. And so, clean that up and make sure that it's really guest centric.
Yeah. And if you start off with something kind of small and more portable, it gives you also the flexibility then to try it out maybe in a couple of different areas.
Yeah.
So you can maybe fine tune that a little bit before you maybe go with something more permanent.
Great idea. All right. Last but not least, well, before we do the last one, because it's very quick, let's just recap. So first we'd said it starts online. Next, can I find your church, both sort of in GPS and physically as I drive up? Don't neglect the parking lot. Make sure you have guest spaces available and sort of a team of folks ready to greet people as they're walking into the building. Your lobby should look and smell fresh. So making sure that that space is updated is really important, and that it smells nice. Kid spaces should be kid-friendly. Safety first, number one, but also making sure that it's a space that kids like to be at and parents want to bring their kids there. Making sure your worship space is clean and functional. So again, just keeping that updated. It doesn't need to be fancy or expensive, but just thoughtful and intentional. Speaking of intentional, the next one was be intentional about interior signage. Make sure people know where to go and who you are based on the signs they're seeing in and around your building. We just talked then about making a good guest connection and information center and having that in an obvious location. And AJ's great idea of if you don't have one right now, start with something small that's portable so you can kind of test a little bit, beta test the best place to put that. And then finally, last but certainly not least, it's a small thing, but it's really important, which is don't neglect maintenance details. So what are the kinds of things that we're looking for here, AJ?
Yeah, I mentioned it up above, but like ceiling tiles. I mean, if you've got a drop ceiling with the classic white ceiling tiles, if you've had any leak in the roof at some point, it's now stained, that rusty looking color. Have those things on hand, swap them out. Obviously, you need to take care of that roof problem, but if you can't do that yet, and every 6 weeks you got to replace a tile, do that. There's going to be things that you're just overlooking. You just need to get, just put on your guest glasses and walk back through your space. Other things, look for scuffs on walls. High traffic areas, especially maybe around children's areas. The walls maybe just need a little bit of touch up. You don't have to change the color every single time you paint. Just freshen things up. Keep that on hand.
I was just going to say, just last week I was visiting with a friend of mine who pastors a church in Ohio. And as I was kind of hanging out with him and talking with him, his guy who cleans the building was going around with putty. And they're a growing church, by the way. They're in a really small facility that's kind of an older building. That's maybe like 30 years old or 35 years old. And he was going around with putty, and he was just patching up spots. It was in the kids area, so that gets scuffed quite a bit. And he had a little small bucket of paint and some putty, and he was going around and patching the scuffs. And that's what growing churches do. They pay attention to those things.
Yeah.
And just as a part of regular course of business, they're finding the scuffs, they're patching the little holes, and they're painting it. So I don't even think that they were thinking wow, we're really doing something above and beyond. It was just a part of the culture there that they maintain the facility well.
That really is kind of just a great example to sort of wrap this up on, because that's a philosophy, that's a culture that's getting built in the church. That's an outlook and a point of view that details matter, and we want to put our best foot forward with guests.
No one is ever going to return to your church because you had taken care of the weeds in the flower bed. No one is oh, they were really good with their flower beds, so I'm coming back. But not paying attention to details will keep people from coming back. And that is a really important distinction. It might not be the reason why a person comes back, but not taking care of those details will be a reason why people won't come back. Listen, we love you guys so much. We really appreciate you. We hope that this is helpful for you to help get your facility guests ready. Nothing in here should be earth-shatteringly expensive. A lot of these things you can implement without spending any money, just spending a little bit of time. And then again, just a sort of a hack. If you're going to invest money in some renovation, I would do it in this order. Start with your lobby because it's the least expensive and it's a quick win. Every guest walks through it. 2, then your kid spaces. And then 3, your worship space last. I would renovate in that order. So we love you. I appreciate you guys. Thank you for subscribing and for leaving a review and for sharing this with your friends in ministry. Check out today's show notes, malfersgroup.com/11, the number 11, malfersgroup.com/11. We will see you next week.